his opinions by the excesses of the British government. But he nowhere contends with the radical views of politics laid out in Common Sense, and it seems unlikely that Burke would have failed to react badly to those views had he encountered them. Talk of a regency, or temporary substitute for the king, soon began and set off an explosive political crisis about the power of the regent. The most plausible regent was the man who would succeed the king should his illness prove fatal: his son, the 26-year-old Prince George. The prince was known to harbor deep hostility to the Tory Prime Minister William Pitt, and was indeed a personal friend of Whig leader Charles James Fox. Pitt, in an effort to prevent his government's dismissal, introduced a regency bill that would have placed far-reaching limits on the power of the regent, obliging the regent to keep the existing government in place and restraining him from exercising most of the powers of the monarch. But considering Burke's behavior in the crisis, he clearly began to feel profound apprehension for the essential stability of the British system. The sight of the Tories arguing against the authority of the Crown, and many of his fellow Whigs being slowly convinced of the merits of their case, aroused a genuine concern about a ruinous Republican revolution in Britain, which would, in every way, color his reaction to events in France soon after. Thomas Paine, with whom Burke had exchanged a few brief and cordial letters since Paine's visit, did not help things. He wrote to Burke from France in the midst of the crisis to suggest that Burke propose a national convention to be fairly elected for the purpose of taking the state of the nation into consideration and essentially reorganizing the regime from scratch. Which may aid him in his operations and make him compass useful objects without a perpetual struggle, it becomes him to remit much of his activity. But retirement was not to be. The dispirited letter to Charlemont was dated July 10, 1789, 4 days before the storming of the Bastille and the beginning of the most celebrated and intense period of Burke's political life, and the period that would bring him most directly into conflict with Paine. own revolution and the empire of rights and legitimate government. Dispirited by the Regency crisis, which he believed revealed that the Whigs, and British society more generally, simply had no stomach for radical democratization, Paine had turned his ambitions and hopes to France, where he returned a few months before the outbreak of the French Revolution. He was by then acquainted with the early leaders of the Revolution, including especially the Marquis de Lafayette, who had taken a crucial part in the American Revolution, took part in some of their deliberations, and even played a minor part in drafting the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. Delivered in a tenor of hope that the revolution in France is certainly a forerunner to other revolutions in Europe. This letter surely played a role in confirming Burke's concerns and inciting his worst fears about the revolution in France. What worried him above all was the combination of philosophical pretensions and applied savagery of the revolution, mob rule making its case in metaphysical abstractions. Paine was no advocate of mob rule, to be sure, but his case for the revolution, that it directly applied the political philosophy of the Enlightenment, seeking to instantiate the ideals of an individualist egalitarianism, was precisely the sort Burke feared most for its corrosive effect on people's reverence for their society's political institutions and traditions. His sermon and the accompanying letter left him with a considerable degree of uneasiness. He was alarmed not only about the celebration of events in France, but especially about Price's attempt to recast English history in the mold of the French Revolution. Price had argued that the Glorious Revolution itself had established the principle that the monarchy was subject to popular choice, exactly the view Burke opposed in the Regency crisis, and indeed that the Glorious Revolution was fought over unalienable rights. It was this effort to commandeer the English Constitution for the revolutionary cause that Burke could see creeping into the thought of his fellow Whigs. He would oppose this effort most adamantly in his writings about France. Do such a war, and perhaps many such. The revolution was a mortal threat to liberty, and no friend of liberty should be warm to it. Burke had laid down his marker, and from this point, at great cost to his standing in his party and to the immense ire of many of his friends, would be an unbending and very public opponent of the French Revolution. He criticized it in exceedingly harsh terms on almost every imaginable ground, and offered a stern defense of the English regime against the onslaught of a theoretical politics intent on uprooting all long-standing social institutions and practices. was perhaps the best of Burke's writing. But it was also a deep and serious work of political thought, and the first sustained assessment and dissection of the claims of liberal radicalism in the age of revolutions. Burke begins with a defense of the English system from what he takes to be the distortions of Price and his fellows. By suggesting that the Glorious Revolution made the British government legitimate because it had put in place an elective monarchy, Burke says Price and others delegitimize all prior English history. His own political theory, the theory taken up in this book, as an answer to the theories of natural rights underlying the revolution. Burke concludes with an extended comparison of the French and English systems of government, economies, and social orders. His comparison reflects very poorly on the wisdom of the French revolutionaries and seeks to highlight Britain's relative stability, prosperity, and comfort in an effort to suggest to his countrymen that emulating France would be disastrous. whom they had thought of as something of a fellow traveler. News of Burke's vehement opposition to the revolution had reached Paine in France soon after Burke's fiery speech in Parliament in February 1790, and Paine immediately understood that a response was essential. In the heated debate culture of the era, an attack from so prominent and effective a critic could not be left to simmer. When he then also heard that Burke would publish a pamphlet against the revolution, Paine promised his French friends he would write a response to make their case to the English-speaking world. Leading with a systematic attempt to refute or dismiss Burke's key points, it quickly turns to an enthusiastic case for human liberty. Paine writes with resolute confidence in the efficacy of reason in political life. He argues that the revolution is the working out of inescapable principles of politics, and that its success and extension are therefore essentially inevitable. The objections of its opponents, including Burke's, merely mark the alarm of those who see that their old and unjust systems of privilege and oppression are in danger. He is persuaded that all this has become possible in his time. From what we now see, nothing of reform on the political world ought to be held improbable. It is an age of revolutions in which everything may be looked for. What emerges is a set of principles consistent with Paine's writings during the American War, but worked out more thoroughly and philosophically, and therefore now more clearly at odds with Burke's view of the world. Like Burke, however, Paine addressed himself to an English audience and used the question of France to raise the question of the English regime, its past and especially its future. And Paine certainly succeeded in reaching an English readership. Rights of Man likely sold tens of thousands of copies and reached a wide audience well beyond London's elite, and well beyond Burke's readership. Whigs by his sharp break with Fox. He therefore decided to make his case in writing again. In August 1791, he published an appeal from the new to the old Whigs to try to address all these varied challenges at once. The appeal articulates many of the same ideas found in the Reflections and earlier writings, but with more light and less heat, and it grounds them in a deeper contention with some basic political and philosophical questions. Burke claims for himself the mantle of the great Whig tradition and describes his opponents in the party as hungry for radical democracy. the next steps on liberalism's path. He advocates for a public pension system for the poor, free public education, public benefits for parents, more parliamentary representation for the lower classes, and a progressive income tax. He even offers a plan for world peace through the extension of reason and knowledge. If men will permit themselves to think as rational beings ought to think, nothing can appear more ridiculous and absurd than to waste public funds on military expenditures. And war seemed increasingly likely on the continent, while in France the revolution turned to terror. The execution of the French king in January 1793 wrought a decisive change of attitudes in London, and the British public and political leadership alike soon turned sharply anti-French. By the end of that year, England was officially at war with France, and the reversal of public sentiment Burke had sought was largely, though of course not simply or entirely, achieved, with much help from the disastrous course of the Revolution itself. This turn against the French did not, however, resolve the profound questions brought to the surface by the Revolution and taken up with such passion by Burke and Paine. Was the philosophy of the Revolution misguided at its core? Or did the French revolutionaries merely fail to live up to it? much of the rest of the revolution, all the way until the fall of 1802. But as the movement's leaders grew increasingly radical and his own friends fell increasingly into the background, Paine became estranged from those in power, even spending several months in prison for affiliating with moderate rebels deemed insufficiently zealous. He devoted himself to what he took to be the logical next chapter of his intellectual project, a book in defense of deism, the view that God's existence and work are accessible to reason without need for revelation or organized religion, and so against most established religions. This final book of Paine's made precisely the argument that Burke's very first published writing had risen to oppose decades earlier. Men at Westminster Abbey, but in accordance with his will, Burke was buried near his home at Beaconsfield. in political life? An unusual and unfamiliar question that, to this day, often sits silently at the heart of our politics. The immense influence of Paine's case for American independence and the author's reputation for brilliant and fiery rhetoric, we expect to be greeted with a passionate call to arms and a catalogue of British offenses. But Paine takes his time getting to the American crisis, which does not really appear until the pamphlet's third section, and instead launches into a thought experiment he insists is essential to grounding any theory of politics. In order to gain a clear and just idea of the design and end of government, let us suppose a small number of persons settled in some sequestered part of the earth, unconnected with the rest. They will then represent the first peopling of any country or of the world. from man himself, apart from society, and therefore, in essence, before society. The only reliable source of authority is the original source. If a dispute about the rights of man had risen at the distance of 100 years from the creation, it is to this source of authority they must have referred, and it is to this same source of authority that we must now refer. Through time tells us nothing of great importance about human life. That is, social relations and distinctions built up over generations have no inherent authority. And it means also that human beings are always most fully understood as distinct and equal individuals. and like John Locke, on whom they drew. To make the case for individual rights and social equality, these thinkers built on theories of how individuals first formed societies. But more than most, and certainly more than Locke, Paine emphasizes the difference between the gathering of human beings into society, driven by the need to meet necessities and by the desire for company, and the establishment of governments over these societies. For Paine, there is a crucial middle step between the state of nature and the political community, the natural society that exists at first without a government. Government has failed to carry out its functions or has violated the rights of its citizens. Such a reversion allows a society to, as Paine puts it, go back to nature for information and regenerate itself. Thus, as Paine famously declares, we have it in our power to begin the world over again. By throwing off our government, we can regenerate our original society and can see government begin as if we lived at the beginning of time. This is what a revolution means for Paine. It is, at its core, a return to the distant past to begin again, and better. This audiobook is continued on Disc 3.